that.
No,
You know,
I
you're
want to make sure I have. It's going to count me down the minutes I have left on the tape here soon. Yeah.
From the mic? Okay, okay, thank you. Your program says that I'm an MD, and that's not correct. I'm a different kind of doctor. A couple days ago, I saw a man who he had tattoos of spider webs all over his arms, and he was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Trust me, I'm a doctor." I didn't ask him what kind of doctor he was, but I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm not an MD. I'm a doctor of ministry, and that means that among other things, I get to not have to buy into some of the presuppositions in biblical studies that I'm going to talk about in just a few moments. I don't have any visuals for you today. I've been very impressed by some of the visuals that the presenters have had for us. I don't have any of those because I'm going to be talking primarily about a text. So the only thing that you get to look at now is me. And that's why I wore a suit. That's all I can tell you. One other thing I'll say before I start is that a wise person back in seminary told all of us, when you get up to speak in a situation like this where there's a podium, you want to visibly take off your watch and you want to set it up there, right in front of yourself. He said, it's not that you're ever going to look at it, but it gives the people hope. So let's begin. We'll begin this brief look at a particular New Testament text by acknowledging one relevant fact, and that is that New Testament scholars have, for the most part, avoided the Shroud of Turin. Professor Simon J. Joseph, who is himself a New Testament scholar, discussed this in The Shroud and the Historical Jesus, Challenging the Disciplinary Divide in 2012. He's right to say that, and I quote, "Today, most biblical scholars, whatever their personal faith commitments and affiliations might be, do not rely on theological arguments or medieval relics to settle historical problems." End of quote. He goes on to state particular reasons why biblical scholars have not addressed the Shroud. The first reason Professor Joseph gives is the belief, bolstered by the 1988 radiocarbon dating results, that the Shroud is a medieval forgery. Joseph notes, however, that scholars were ignoring the Shroud long before that. Second, since the areas of specialty for biblical scholars are biblical languages, various kinds of text criticism and theology, not medicine, anatomy, spectrometry, botany, etc., biblical scholars do not feel competent to engage in a subject that would take them into these other fields. Joseph adds that there, quote, may be risk of professional embarrassment, end of quote. Third and most important is what he calls methodological constraint. Biblical studies, like all scientific fields of study, he says, operates under the presupposition of methodological naturalism. This is the part I said before I don't buy. Methodological naturalism assumes the non-existence of any supernatural or paranormal phenomena influencing historical events. Professor Joseph says the Shroud could revolutionize New Testament studies. With With all due respect to Professor Joseph, I would state things more strongly. The Shroud promises not to revolutionize biblical studies, but to affirm mightily the work of some, while absolutely destroying the work of others. The Shroud tells us that the Gospels present a more faithful telling of the Jesus story than many scholars today have been willing to accept or concede. Think of John Dominic Crossan, who contends that Jesus' body was never placed in a tomb, but left on the cross for dogs to eat. Think of Marcus Borg and Bart Ehrman, who, like Crossan, deny the resurrection, and much more. The Shroud is a problem for all such scholars who present a historical Jesus vastly different from the Christ of faith as revealed in the Bible. The more evidence that accumulates for the authenticity of the Shroud, the more the Shroud threatens to be the iceberg to their Titanic, and they steer far from it. Samuli Juntunen, a Finnish theological professor, wrote of the Shroud's challenge to theologians. Now we're talking about theologians and not biblical scholars for a second. But he points out, upon reflecting before an image of the Shroud himself, he reflects upon those theologians who like to place the resurrection of Jesus, as they say, outside of history. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody talk about that before, that the resurrection is outside of history. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, the Shroud, says Juntunen, wants to place the resurrection among hard facts. So for theologians as well as biblical scholars, the Shroud can be unwelcome. What liberal biblical scholars and theologians have invested in degrees, prestige, careers, faculty positions, publications, so on, is going to lose value the more one learns about the Shroud of Turin. So no wonder they stay away. Well, so the lack of attention to the Shroud from New Testament scholars and theologians helps to explain why it is that here we are in 2014, just now considering the possibility of another New Testament reference outside the Gospels narratives of the burial of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb. That reference is Galatians 3:1, and here it is from the English Standard Version. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. This paper will look briefly at the ways this passage has been understood in the past, before anyone thought it might be connected in some way with the Shroud. We shall evaluate the proposals for understanding Paul's words, and we'll evaluate them against the proposal that Paul refers to the Shroud, used by early missionaries in the Galatian region. Luke, a friend and missionary assistant to Paul, wrote the gospel that bears his name and the Acts of the Apostles, and in reporting the events following the resurrection of Jesus, Luke says, he presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. That's Acts 1:3. By many proofs, in Greek, en polois tekmarios. What were these? Well, in his gospel, Luke specifically mentions, of course, a linen shroud purchased by Joseph of Arimathea for Jesus' burial. Why he does this is best explained by a knowledge on his part that the shroud had significance later on, beyond what Luke would write of in his gospel. That tallies with the mention of the shroud by all four of the gospel writers, and a non-canonical writing we're going to visit now. Jerome, who died around 400, biblical scholar beyond peer in his time, provides us with some quotations from the now lost Gospel of the Hebrews. He writes, and I'm just going to give a portion of this, also the Gospel called according to the Hebrews, recently translated by me into Greek and Latin, which Origen often uses, says, after the resurrection of the Savior, quote, Now the Lord, when he had given the linen cloth to the servant of the high priest, went to James and appeared to him. I'm going to just stop what Jerome writes right there, but there's the important part. Now the Lord, when he had given the linen cloth to the servant of the high priest, went to James and appeared to him. This quotation from the Gospel, according to the Hebrews, comes to us without a larger context, but we have enough here to say at the very least that Jesus' burial shroud was considered a lasting emblem of his death and resurrection by those who used the Gospel of the Hebrews, which was written somewhere between 80 and 150. What would the early church have done with an item like Jesus' burial cloth, if they in fact had it? We would expect the leaders of the church to have saved and preserved it, especially if it came to bear the image of Jesus, whether that happened instantly or gradually. In the missionary environment of the apostolic church, we must realize that the shroud could be a valuable tool in the hands of missionary apostles. The idea that Paul could be alluding to the Shroud of Turin in Galatians 3:1 may seem completely fanciful at first. But if missionaries in fact used the Shroud of Turin in any way at all, with its image of Jesus as evidence of his crucifixion and resurrection, the greatest missionary, Paul, would have known about it. To this discussion, we must now add one more important item of information. There is proof that the Shroud of Turin was exposed to the open air of the Anatolian region, which includes biblical Galatia. Dr. Max Fry, and we've heard about him. I'm not going to say as much about him as I had originally planned to. I'll just give you the results, some of the results of his findings. He writes, according to palynology, the shroud must have been exposed to open air in Turkey because 20 of the found species are abundant in Anatolia. And then he mentions Urfa, and we've seen the maps. We've heard about Edessa, and we've heard about Constantinople. I can't ask Dr. Fry, none of us can, but he said the steppe region. He talked about Anatolia. That's really in the middle between Edessa and Constantinople. And that's again where biblical Galatia is. Now here's the situation in Galatia. Paul traveled through southern Galatia on what's now called his first missionary journey. That's in Acts 13 through 14:27. Indeed, he returned there on his second and third journeys. In his letter to the Galatians, he laments that the Galatians have, he says, so quickly turned from what he preached to accept another gospel. Other Christians, known today as the Judaizers, we don't know who they were, but that's what they're called, the Judaizers. They had come to Galatia after Paul with their own message, which was in conflict with his. We can't know if the Galatians were theologically astute enough to really be aware of the vast difference, but Paul was. Biblical scholars debate what they term the Northern Galatian hypothesis, the Southern Galatian hypothesis, and yet a third hypothesis as to when Paul wrote his letter and which of the Galatians he was talking about, north or south. But that goes beyond the scope of the paper. Here's the point. However you cut it, the Judaizers are the reason for this letter. The Judaizers taught that Gentiles could be saved by Jesus as long as they effectively became Jews first through circumcision. Perhaps some of them left it there. Perhaps others insisted on keeping more or all of the law of Moses. But Paul himself, a scholar of the law, saw any required obedience to the law on the part of Gentiles for what it really was, a competing means to salvation and therefore a different gospel. The Judaizers were traveling on the heels of the great apostle. They were missionaries. Before the Jerusalem Council held in about 50, the opinions of the Judaizers had not yet been overruled by the 12 and by James in Jerusalem. In other words, nobody's wearing white hats, nobody's wearing black hats at this time. They're all Christians, but with different views. So, could an item such as the Shroud of Turin have come into the hands of the Judaizers? We would have to say that it could. Whoever in the Jerusalem church kept the shroud would most likely have been on speaking terms, and maybe good terms, with Jewish Christians of other locations. Indeed, Jewish Christians did live in other places early on. Paul's encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road dates to 1.5 years after the resurrection. Christians were already in Damascus, in numbers justifying Paul's journey there to arrest them. This is when he was still Saul, the persecutor. That persecution followed Stephen's martyrdom, which scattered believers to many cities in other parts of the world. Perhaps persons other than the Judaizers displayed the shroud. Tradition places John, Andrew, and Philip just farther west of Galatia in Asia Minor. I think the Pollen still works. John's gospel has the most to say about Jesus' burial cloths, after all, with the beloved disciple coming to faith by seeing them in the tomb. He's one logical candidate for the keeper of the shroud. Peter came to Antioch, not far to the east of Galatia, and the first letter of Peter names the Galatians among those to whom he writes. He is a candidate for the keeper of the shroud as well, and may have displayed it in Antioch to be seen by traveling Christians from elsewhere. So some of the Galatians could have seen it there, some of the Galatians could have seen it farther west. Now, Paul says, "Who has bewitched you?" He writes to the Galatians with passion and anger. He wants to win them back. He's furious with the Judaizers, and he's disappointed with those Galatians that the Judaizers have won over. Despite his clear and powerful proclamation of Jesus Christ crucified as the end of the law, the completion of the law, the Galatians have been swayed to adopt obedience to the law of Moses as their means of salvation. To Paul, it's as though they have been placed under a spell. A few commentators here introduce the evil eye, as though that's what Paul's writing about, because of what follows, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. But the evil eye refers to the stare of a magician, which imparts a curse. Paul's referring to something that the Galatians have seen. Paul uses language that suggests the supernatural, bewitched. If the Judaizers or someone else had exhibited the shroud in Galatia with its mysterious image of Jesus, and the result was the convincing of the Galatians to keep the law of Moses in order to be saved, well, we can perhaps see why he used that word. Then Paul says, "Before whose eyes," kat ophthalmos. Paul would later write to the Romans that faith comes by hearing, 10:17. That thought's consistent with Paul's activity all through his career, announcing the gospel of Jesus to people who might believe and be saved. In contrast, what he says here is not about hearing, but about seeing. The Galatians have seen something. Remember, Paul's engaged in a hot debate in the form of a letter. If he attempts to make a point in a way that's weak or illogical, he will lose. He can't appeal to the Galatians by saying, in effect, "You saw something with your own eyes," if both he and the Galatians know nobody saw anything. Paul certainly means that the Galatians saw something extraordinary. We would have expected him to say, "It was in your hearing that Jesus Christ was publicly proclaimed as crucified." But that's not what he says. He says, "You saw it." Now, the word for portrayed, proegraphe. The word prographo, the dictionary form, may be broken into two parts. The first is pro, and that means before or above, and grapho means write or draw. And I'll just kind of again briefly summarize. I've got three dictionary definitions here, kind of collapsed to make it simple. First, written beforehand in the same document. Second, it can mean what was written before, as in an older document. Third, it can mean to show forth or proclaim publicly, placard. third definition makes reference also to Greek writers which carry the original meaning of draw or paint. So we're starting to get at an image idea there. So did Paul's use of prographo refer to his own words written earlier? That would be definition 1. Nope, because Paul wrote no letter earlier to the Galatians. This is clear from the context of the letter. There's just no realistic thought among any New Testament scholar that there's an earlier letter to the Galatians. Did Paul mean for the word to be interpreted as written in the past by prophets? You saw with your own eyes the scriptural texts before you. That's pretty untenable. First, under what circumstances would Gentiles actually stand before scrolls of Isaiah, Jeremiah, or the Psalms to see what was written there? It's inconceivable. Second, even if they did do that, they wouldn't have been able to read them because they were illiterate and they were Greek speakers and not Hebrew speakers. Did Paul refer to some kind of placard or picture? This would mean that someone actually placed Christ crucified in words on a sign or else in the form of a picture. This answers the requirement for something visible to the eye, but upon closer examination, this also fails. You know, when they have these full contact fighting things, between the bloody rounds, they'll maybe have like a fashion model walk across the ring with a card that says round 6. And really, is that what's going on in Galatia, that somebody there is holding up a sign that says Christ crucified, really, when you think about it? And to draw a picture of someone on a cross would have not amounted to a helpful visual aid in this context, but an obscenity. Further, iconography doesn't begin in the church for quite a while. Now, did Paul refer to his own wounds? The commentators don't really get at that, but that's maybe I think that's the best answer short of the Shroud. He'd suffered violence in bringing the gospel to the Galatian cities of Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. He frequently writes of his union, and the union of every Christian with Christ. That's no less true for Paul himself. The conclusions of Galatians, he states, from now on, let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus, 6:17. This has sometimes been taken as a reference to the stigmata, but it's probably not. He's probably talking about the bruises, the wounds, the fractures, the scars that he endured. And he's saying they continue to be in character with the Christ that he serves and he's been united with in baptism. The difficulties with Paul's own wounds is what the Galatians saw are these. It's not immediately clear from the context of the letter. If Paul's equating his own wounds visible when he was among the Galatians with the public image of Christ crucified, he'd have to say more to make it clear. The shroud, on the other hand, is already an immediate image of Christ crucified, needing no clarification. Second, Paul stresses Christ crucified. His wounds, unless he was referring to the stigmata, which he was probably not, didn't resemble Jesus' crucifixion wounds. Acts reports that Paul was stoned and believed dead at Lystra, and Paul writes in Galatians that they would have given him their eyes if they could, implying that his eyes were perhaps injured, but his injuries don't comport with crucifixion. More importantly, the perfect tense Paul employs when he uses the word estauromenos, crucified, it means something already accomplished in the past with present result. So he's not describing a person being crucified, but he's describing a picture of someone already crucified to death. Paul speaks of crucifixion with respect to all believers, to be sure, but he is likely not speaking of himself and his own wounds as what the Galatians saw. So, if the Shroud of Turin had been brought to Galatia by missionaries, whether Judaizers or someone else, if some of the Galatians had traveled to another Christian community and seen the shroud there, all requirements are satisfied for understanding Paul's words in Galatians 3, and the other explanations leave us wanting. If it was the Judaizers who displayed the shroud, what the Galatians saw, evidence of the crucifixion really making Paul's point, should have reinforced what Paul preached to them, not the Judaizers' counter message. And what irony! Makes all the more sense than that Paul would say, "O foolish Galatians." Before their eyes had been some image of Christ crucified, unique and convincing by its own nature. If the Judaizers were the ones to show the shroud, we can also understand Paul's wry reference to bewitching. In view of the evidence that the Shroud of Turin was exposed to the open air in Anatolia, and the problems with the various conventional attempts to explain Paul's words in Galatians 3:1, the Shroud of Turin becomes at least a plausible answer to the question of what Paul referred to as a public portrayal of Christ crucified, which at least some of the Galatians saw with their own eyes.